Well, Carol Lewis is going to introduce us to.
Good morning. 30 years ago, when I started doing research and having experiences about reincarnation, I found Christopher Bache's book, Life Cycles. And as you can tell, I've got many markers because I've read it probably 5 times now. I still learn something every time I read it. And a few years ago, I reached out to Christopher to see if he could talk for us. He had a really busy schedule then, but last year I reached out again, and so not only do you need to ask, but you need to be persistent. And here he is. I am beyond thrilled to have him as a speaker here. His career has been amazing. He's a professor emeritus of philosophy and religious studies at Youngstown University. He is an adjunct professor at California Institute of Integral Studies. I've always wanted to go there, but never seemed to make it. He's an emeritus fellow with the Institute of Noetic Science. In fact, his talk last year at National Ions is what made me reach out to him yet again. And he's advisory council for the Grof Legacy Training Program. And if some of you know Stanislav Grof's work with LSD and then holotropic breath work, I was introduced to Grof through holotropic breath work. So our paths, I feel like, have crossed many, many times. But what really struck me, a chord with me about Christopher Bache is I was having mystical experiences, and I found I couldn't talk to just anybody about those experiences. That he spoke, even though his pathway was slightly different than mine, his pathway to those mystical experiences and the language was the same, which said to me that there's something about this. So, more recently, his book, LSD and the Mind of the Universe, talks about really in depth, and you can see I've got lots of markers in there too, really in depth about how he came to have all of these experiences. And so it opens up a conversation in ways that are mind-blowing. And so get ready, be prepared for a wonderful presentation to expand your consciousness, and welcome so much for joining us here, for you all, and for Christopher Bache. Thank you for sharing your wisdom.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning. I wish I could see all of your faces. I just have to assume that you're all there, but it's a pleasure to be here with you. And I'm going to be talking for a while, and then we'll go to questions and answers. And for me, a talk is just a good way to get to questions and answers, because that's where the juicy part is. But let me warm things up with taking you into my book, LSD and the Mind of the Universe. So I'm going to do a PowerPoint with this. So let's see if the gods are being kind here, the tech gods. Okay. Tom, you let me know if this isn't coming through properly. What you should be seeing is a picture.
Great, thank you.
Okay, good. Of LSD and the Mind of the Universe. And I only have about an hour to take you into this subject. And that's a very challenging task, because I'm going to be describing a journey of first unusually deep LSD experiences and many LSD experiences. Most people, when they write about their psychedelic experiences, they're writing after only a few of them. Julianne of Norwich, when she reflected on her near-death mystical experience, she reflected on one experience for years and wrote a whole book on it. When you try to summarize these many experiences or this long a journey in a short period of time, people can either think you're crazy or that this is a very dangerous undertaking. And so I just want to start with that caveat, and let's jump into it and see where we go. First, I'd like to begin with a quote that is the epigraph of the book from, let me get this band down here all the way, from Albert Hoffman, where he says, get this in here, okay, whoop. Alienation from nature and the loss of the experience of being part of the living creation is the greatest tragedy of our materialistic era. It is the causative reason for ecological devastation and climate change. Therefore, I attribute absolute highest importance to consciousness change. I regard psychedelics as catalyzers for this. They are tools which are guiding our perception towards deeper areas of our human existence, so that we, again, become aware of our spiritual essence. And in this context, let me just mention, I understand psychedelics to be simply amplifiers of consciousness. They amplify consciousness, and what happens during the times we are under their influence very much depends upon how we use this temporary hypersensitized state of consciousness. If we stay in contact with the outer world, it gets diluted and mixed with all sorts of things that are happening in the physical world. But if we enter into deep internal introspection, if we go deep within, then we start to uncover layers upon layers of the mind. So, clearly today, we all know we're undergoing, how come this isn't coming up for me? There we go. A psychedelic renaissance. Very exciting. After 40 years of hiatus in psychedelic research, it seems like so many universities, so many institutes are popping up doing psychedelic research. And I want to just differentiate some of the focus points of this research. First, and the most important probably, is therapeutic healing, the focus on therapeutic healing. Wonderful work being done at MAPS, Johns Hopkins. There are about 8 or 9 universities in the United States, all over Europe, working in integrating psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, working on post-traumatic stress, depression, death anxiety. Really important work being done, very rigorous studies, control samples, very high mathematical analysis of outcomes. It is really primarily through the therapeutic, demonstrating the therapeutic efficacy of psychedelics that we are really bringing psychedelics back into our cultural discussion. A separate aspect of psychedelic research in the Renaissance is the focus on spiritual awakening. There's an overlap between therapeutic healing and spiritual awakening, but they really are different agendas. And you can see that agenda if you take a look at this anthology, Zigzag Zen, which is a discussion between the Buddhist contemplative community and the psychedelic community. Are psychedelics useful to genuine awakening, or are they a distraction? Back and forth discussion. Spiritual awakening is supported by therapeutic healing, but spiritual awakening is something different. It's a different project, a different focus that emerges. Now, most of the discussion in the psychedelic renaissance really kind of focuses on these two objectives or these two themes, and actually most of it is on therapeutic healing. But I'd like to suggest that there is a third area of research, and that is the area of cosmological exploration. And I think my work falls in this area. I am not a psychologist, I'm not a psychotherapist, and while I started my psychedelic work with a an interest in accelerating my spiritual awakening. The method that I adopted was so intense and so extreme, and the focus was so intense that it pushed my psychedelic experiences far beyond the project of spiritual awakening, and it became an exploration of the deep structure of the universe, hence the name LSD and the mind of the universe. So my lineage derives from Stanislav Grof, and his book, Realms of the Human Unconscious, that was published just 2 years before I began my academic career, was a turning point in my life. Because I came out of graduate school a deeply convinced agnostic with a strong atheistic inclination, even though I had been raised in a religious background and actually had been in the seminary for 4 years studying to be a Catholic priest. By the time I got done with all my graduate education, I was pretty hardcore atheist at that point. But this book was a turning point, and followed by his book, LSD Psychotherapy, which is basically a manual for the responsible structuring of psychedelic sessions. I very quickly realized that Stan's work represented a major breakthrough, not just in psychology, but in philosophy of religion, which was my area. And so I began a systematic psychedelic inquiry in 1979. Now, Stan's work differentiates clearly between two different modalities of working with psychedelics therapeutically: low-dose psycholytic therapy, high-dose psychedelic therapy. Most of his work, before he started publishing his books, was in psycholytic therapy, where you're working with low doses and peeling away the personal and collective unconscious layer by layer, layer by layer. And this is largely the form of therapy which is being replicated in the psychedelic renaissance today. Lower doses, gentler psychedelics, psilocybin, MDMA, to peel away the personal unconscious by layers. Psychedelic therapy was restricted to 3 sessions in the early days, and Stan was working with a population of people who were dying of cancer. They knew they were going to die. They weren't trying to change that outcome, but they were trying to give them a glimpse of where they were going when they died. They were trying to trigger not a processing of all their unfinished personal issues in the personal psyche, but to trigger essentially a near-death episode experience to give them a glimpse of where they were going and thus to ease their death anxiety. These were limited to 3 sessions. So I came along years later and I thought, well, if you could do high-dose therapy in 3 sessions, you could probably do it safely in more than 3 sessions. So to make a long story short, I think this was probably unwise on my part, what I ended up doing was 73 high-dose sessions over a 20-year period. I worked for 4 years, I took a break for 6 years, and then I worked for another 10 years. I did essentially about 5 sessions a year. And I'd like to emphasize the methodology here because, I was working in a period when LSD was illegal, scientific research had been stopped. I didn't have the advantage of control studies. I was a bit of a bridge figure between the early generation, Stan Grof's generation, and the new generation of young workers working today. I did this work between when I was 30 and 50 years old, and I'm 73 now. I used the same protocol in every session, the same set and setting, same substance, same dose level, same sitter, who was at that time my wife, Carol, was a clinical psychologist, the same recording process, and even did it in the same location, basically in Northeast Ohio. Now, I think the standardization of the protocol was really important because by standardizing as many of the variables as possible and keeping everything as constant as possible, what it did was to generate a long, sustained communion with the universe, a point of contact, a point of dialogue with the universe that allowed a progressive deepening of the conversation over many years. At the time, I thought of myself as simply doing an extended series of psychedelic therapy. But towards the end of my journey, when I was looking back, I realized that there were many things going on that weren't reflected in the early descriptions of psychedelic therapy. There were many challenges in working with psychedelics the way I had. So I felt it needed a new name. So I call it psychedelic exploration. It's not primarily therapeutically focused. The protocol is the protocol of high dose LSD psychedelic therapy. But the difference is, whereas psychedelic therapy is restricted to 3 sessions in those studies, mine continued for 73 sessions. Again, I don't think this was necessarily wise. Looking back, knowing what I know today for different reasons, I do not recommend this type of protocol. If I were doing it over again, I would be much gentler on myself. I would work with a balance of lower doses and higher doses. I would work with organic psychedelics, psilocybin, ayahuasca, balancing it with the synthetic psychedelics, which each of them tend to have different kind of ways in which they amplify consciousness. I kept very detailed records of my sessions. After every session, within 24 hours, I made a detailed phenomenological description of the sessions, kept track of all the dates. And even when later I learned of Rick Tarnas's hypothesis and Stan's work on the correlations between astrological transits and what happens in one's sessions, I kept track of my sessions. This is 1 year in 1994. The vertical lines are the sessions. The blue lines would represent, I would consider, ordinary sessions. The red line represents a breakthrough sessions. I was looking at Rick Tarnas's hypothesis that certain transits correlate with breakthrough sessions and other ones don't. No time to go into that here. I want to emphasize that I was working at 500 to 600 micrograms. It's a very high dose of LSD. And I was keeping them completely internalized. I was always isolated from the world, lying down with headphones and eye shades, completely internalized focus. Some people sometimes refer to my work as tripping, and I correct them. This is not tripping. This is a session. In the Japanese meditation tradition, a sesshin is an extended period of meditation, a period set aside for spiritual practice. That's the way I thought of my LSD sessions, as a very intense, concentrated sesshin, a session. When you work like this, I found that aspects of my personal life tended to surface in the beginning and ending of a sessions, represented in these small circles, and the sessions representing the sine waves. When I was in the peak hours of these sessions, I was usually operating far beyond the domain of my personal psyche. I was deep into transpersonal dimensions of consciousness. And the story I'm telling in LSD and the Mind of the Universe is essentially the story of what happened in those large sessions, large circles at the top of the peaks. I really drop out a lot of the personal stories, the things that were relevant to my personal life or personal purification. Those are important components to include in a therapeutic story of psychedelics. But I'm a philosopher of religion. I'm primarily interested in the cosmological story, and in that context, many of the personal details I just dropped out. Of course, all of this journey is a personal journey. I accept that, I honor that. But my focus is on the emerging cosmological insights. Now, when you work in a sustained fashion in this way, you go through not just one death rebirth process, but you go through a spiraling series of death and rebirth processes this image, everything below the line represents kind of time, space, reality, and ordinary consciousness. Above the line represents spiritual reality, transpersonal states of consciousness. And you can think as a psychedelic session as a process in which you make a transition from your egoic reality, represented by the drop at the bottom of the figure, into some level of transpersonal consciousness. Now, there is a death rebirth process because you have to let go of everything which is keeping you small in order to open up to that which is large. And so there is a death rebirth process, and most of the discussion, particularly the therapeutic discussion today, focuses on that first turning of the cycle of death and rebirth, which we call ego death. And this fits in with our discussion of mystical experience because the death of self is usually said to be a prerequisite for opening into deeper experiences of mystical absorption. But what I found in my journey was that there was not one ego death repeating itself over and over, but there were deeper and deeper levels of ego death, that the ego death that the cycle of death and rebirth repeated itself at many different stages of the journey. And ego death was only the first stage as we transition into early spiritual experiences. Now, one way of imaging this is with this image of a nuclear bomb. LSD is often compared to the atomic bomb. Both of them were created in the same decade. But if you compare an atomic blast with an extended series of psychedelic sessions, something which is keeping this transformative fire going and churning over a long period of time, you see that in this atomic blast makes visible layers of the atmosphere that were always there, but were not visible beforehand. So the fire and power and heat of this explosion brings into visible awareness layers of reality that were there, but were beyond our ordinary perception. And this is true also for psychedelic experience. But here I want to transition. We're not talking about bombs. We're talking about exploring the great beauty and grandeur of our physical universe and the consciousness of that universe. And here I want to say that when I was looking back over the whole of my psychedelic journey, and I spent 20 years processing my 20-year journey. After I finished my journey, Spirit said to me, 20 years in, 20 years out, which meant that it would take me at least 20 years to digest 20 years of my journey into the universe. And I think at the time I thought, well, that sounds reasonable, but now I'm beginning to think that was an optimistic projection. I think it'll take lifetimes for me to process these experiences. But when I got to the end, I asked myself about how many layers of the universe or layers of reality could I congregate, would I divide my psychedelic journey into? And I came up with 5 layers. So there were experiences that operated at the level of my personal mind, personal unconscious. Layers that had to do with the collective mind. Layers that had to do with archetypal mind. Layers with causal oneness. And I specifically mentioned causal oneness because there are many different layers of oneness in this exercise. And causal oneness is a quite distinct, intense experience of oneness. And lastly, diamond luminosity. So what I'd like to do is simply, using these categories, just go through and throw up the chapters of the book and say a few words about each chapter, just to give you a sense of some of the content. And of course, it's going to be far too little said for so many experiences. But what I really am hoping is that if you get interested from this talk, maybe you'll read the book, because that's my best attempt to give a full and complete description of this journey. So at personal mind, the chapter dealing there really is crossing the boundary of birth and death. And there's a first introductory chapter, but I'm skipping over that. This is primarily telling the story of crossing what Stan Grof calls the perinatal level of consciousness, a level of consciousness that lies at the interface between physical reality and spiritual reality. When one is crossing that dimension, one has many death rebirth experiences, often reliving one's own birth experience while reliving deaths from former lifetimes. One confronts the deepest metaphysical anxiety around death, around the meaninglessness of existence. From the physical world, if you live just within your physical consciousness, the world appears to be a harsh and brutal place, and not to give much attention, not to care very much what happens to us. And if we all die as soon as our brains collapse, that just makes of life a brutal existence. And all of these fears and all these concerns and possibilities come flooding up during this period of work, until eventually, and this for me was 2 years of work and 10 sessions, your ego, or your time-space identity, is just crushed, just taken apart and dismantled. And you are lifted into spiritual reality. And the reason your egoic identity must be crushed for you to move into deeper spiritual reality is because our time-space identity is just too small. It keeps us small. It keeps us focused on the close at hand. And if you're going to go into deep space, the deep space of consciousness, you must let go of that small boundary. For me, I had to let go of my role as a male, my self-sense as a male, as an academic, as a person concerned with the meaning of life. My sessions completely crushed me by turning me into the opposite of all these things, turning me into women, turning me into women of color, turning me into women who were not necessarily concerned about the meaning of existence. Just shattered me. And the issue, of course, was not women. The issue was my over-identification with my male academic persona. From there, I transitioned into a number of sessions having to do with the collective mind. After I went through this first intense ego death experience, I went into an area of experience which I call the ocean of suffering. I entered repeatedly, systematically, going deeper and deeper into domains of suffering that were absolutely devastating, extremely difficult to navigate. It took a long time to learn how to navigate these dimensions. Terrible anger, violence, and my experience expanded into hundreds of thousands, millions of people, again, systematically over time. At first, I thought these represented a deepening of my ego death, but over time, I came to a different conclusion. I came to the conclusion that these experiences were not about my personal transformation at all, but these experiences were aimed at bringing about some type of healing focused on the collective unconscious, that what was being engaged here, experienced and released into the universe was actually amalgamations of our species unconscious, memories that had been collected within the collective unconscious of our species. I began to understand that just as my personal unconscious holds on to any problematic and undigested experiences from my life, and they can distort my functioning. Likewise, the mind of our species, the collective unconscious, holds on to unintegrated, undigested traumas from its history. And those traumas aggregate into giant memory clusters that I call the metacoic systems. And that what was happening in these sessions was that something was using my sessions to engage and melt some portion of the trauma of human history that was still living inside the collective psyche. Now, I divide my sessions into, usually they just spontaneously divided between a purifying phase followed by an ecstatic phase. Usually you'd go into the purifying phase, the suffering phase, and eventually it would reach a peak climax. You'd go through some version of ego death, and then you'd be spun out into positive transpersonal spaces where you would go into ecstatic experiences. When I would go through the ocean of suffering, and this is for 1 year, when I would come through it, I was spun into a series of experiences that I cover in the chapter, Deep Time in the Soul. I transcended linear time for the first time, and in 7 consecutive sessions, I had the experience of entering deep time, or what I first called whole time, and experiencing my entire life from beginning to end as a simultaneous whole. I experienced all the time moments of my life simultaneously and was taken through my life and was shown its major themes, its major relationships. It was an extraordinarily powerful experience. It gave me a grounding in who I am, what I am. And then I stopped my sessions for 6 years for reasons that I give in the book. After 6 years, when I resumed my sessions, and this is an important point, the ocean of suffering began exactly where it had stopped 6 years before. It just started right there, started up again, and it just kept on grinding, going deeper and deeper for another year. So I spent a total of 2 years in the cleansing portion of the sessions, working in the ocean of suffering. 2 years, but they were separated by a 6-year hiatus. So that's an indication, I think, of the very powerful forces in the universe that are controlling these sessions. Certainly not my individual consciousness was not in any control of these sessions. So during the cleansing portion, once I resumed, I was working in the ocean of suffering again. But in the ecstatic portions, I was taken into a series of experiences that took me far beyond my personal life, had very little relevance to my personal existence, and was given a series of initiations into the universe. It was like I was being given a crash course in Cosmology 101. It took me back seemingly to the beginning of time. It took me into the process of creation. Now, for a snapshot, I, of course, am trying to remember all of my sessions, and it's a really critical part of this work is to remember your sessions, because the more closely you remember every session, it sets a better platform for going deeper into your next session. And I give them names. I not only write up the sessions, I break them into bullet points, and I give them a name. So when I see the name, it triggers a memory of what that particular session was about. So here are the names of the sessions that were covered in this period of time in the initiation into the universe. Okay. I'm just going to let those names suggest to you what some of the content is. You'll see that the master plan is the beginning of something, a beginning of a series of dialogues with the universe that has to do with the larger evolutionary trajectory that humanity is on. At the end of this period, the 24th session, Healing the Collective Wound, the ocean of suffering came to a culmination. It reached an exponential new threshold in processing the pain of the collective psyche came to a crescendo, and then it threw me into a higher level of consciousness, into what I came to understand as the archetypal mind. And at that point, the ocean of suffering never returned in any of my sessions, which really left me with a bit of a puzzle. Why would the episodes of collective suffering stop? Clearly, there is still collective suffering alive within the collective unconscious, but why did it stop in my sessions when there was still work to be done? And I struggled with this. I wrestled with this concept and propose a suggested explanation later in the book. But I was catapulted into archetypal mind, thrown into a deeper level of consciousness that I had ever been thrown into before, which I describe in this chapter, The Greater Real of Archetypal Reality. I was operating far beyond the collective unconscious. To make this transition involved escalating into a huge jump in the energy involved. I was taken into sun flares, volcanoes, just huge purifying experiences of enormous vistas of energy. But the most striking thing about entering this level of consciousness was how old it was. It was ancient. Compared to anything within time space, this dimension of consciousness felt ancient, and it also felt more real than anything within time and space. And I went back and forth over the next year and a half, back and forth between this dimension and time-space consciousness. So this sense of moving into the greater real and coming back into the lesser real of time and space was repeated over and over. And so I want to mention, once I broke through, once you break through to a level of consciousness, working the way I did, all of my sessions kept taking me back to that same threshold, that same level of consciousness. Experiences that were very fragmented and confusing because the whole ontological fabric of reality that I was entering was new and completely not understood by me in the beginning sessions of that level. But then the more frequently I kept going back to it, my mind adapted and I learned how to stay conscious in dimensions of consciousness that had previously swallowed me. When I entered into archetypal reality, my experiences kind of took place at two different levels, at what you might call the high subtle level and the lower subtle level. In the high subtle level, I entered what felt like Plato's concept of archetypal reality, except it wasn't, I experienced archetypes, but not the archetypes that Plato described. Plato described the archetypes as unchanging ideas, eternal ideas in the mind of an infinite being, an unchanging being. What I experienced as archetypal beings were vast, massive beings of incalculable age and space and breadth, but they were alive, they were living, and they were changing, but they were moving extremely slowly compared to the speed with which things move inside time-space reality. It was like stepping off our feverishly spinning solar system with the planets spinning around our star and jumping into the galaxy, which is moving, but at a completely different pace relative to the sun than our planet is moving relative to our sun. So I couldn't see the archetypes. I mean, I saw them, I experienced them, I felt them, I intuited them, but the closest my mind could come to giving them form was to see them as vast galaxies, which was, I think, just the best it could do was to give them a sense of proportion. They were vast, they were ancient, they were just extraordinary. And then from those experiences, I dropped down into a lower level of archetypal reality where I repeatedly had the experience of the human species as a single conscious entity, and that all of our individual lives were cells within this single entity, this spiritual, physical entity. And then I had many experiences exploring the fabric of this unified being and experienced almost kind of like neurological networks running throughout the fabric of humanity and mental networks. I began to experience how each one of us, our mind is embedded within the collective mind, and the themes and issues and illnesses and breakthroughs of our individual minds are all part of the warp and woof of its collective mind. I experienced how each of our diseases and our attempts to heal those diseases are all part of the collective psyche's attempt to heal itself and to grow itself into a healthier form over vast tracts of time. I began to have, in a very powerful series of sessions, a series of experiences in which I began to experience reincarnation as a collective process, not as an individual process. I had already written life cycles by this time, and the story of life cycles, like the story of most stories of reincarnation, is the story of an individual soul incarnating, learning, growing, dying, going back into spiritual reality, incarnating again, making choices, growing by making better and better choices, skillfully making choices, and evolving itself on an individual spiritual journey, which I think is a true account. But now I began to experience from a radically expanded state of consciousness, radically expanded in deep time and deep space, the entire species of our planet as a single organism incarnating, a pulsive incarnation, century by century, all of our individual karmic stories, part of its larger karmic story. And it was at that point that the boundary between individual enlightenment and collective enlightenment dissolved completely. And that really became one of the primary themes of my book, Dark Night, Early Dawn, where I'm really exploring the spiritual evolution, not only of individuals, but of our entire species, and start talking about the dark night of our collective soul. Just as an individual mystic goes through a dark night, the species goes through a purification dark night of its collective soul on its way to waking up spiritually. Moving along, these are the stories, the names of the sessions that I address in this archetypal chapter. And you'll see how much cleansing is continuing to take place. And it's not cleansing taking place at the egoic level. It's a much, much deeper type of cleansing taking place beyond the collective psyche. And this represents kind of an important insight that I just want to mention. And that is, it was at this stage of the work that I discovered that every step into a deeper level of consciousness is a step into a higher level of energy. If you only have glancing contact with this deeper level of consciousness, this may not be apparent. But if you want to have stable recall of a level of reality, you must acclimate to the level of energy that drives, that is the operating level of that level of reality. And that means you must go through more purification processes just to be able to sustain the high levels of energy for hours at a time in that level of consciousness. And this is a pattern that repeated itself over and over again, so that I began to understand that the cycle of death rebirth is really a cycle of purification. It's a cycle of purifying yourself so that you can stay conscious at deep, deep levels of consciousness, deep levels of reality. Okay. From there, I went into an extraordinary year that I describe in a chapter called A Benediction of Blessings. It was a year of just extraordinary blessings. Here are the names of the chapters that I describe. Out of the 8 chapters from that year, I described 4 of them. The forest is an experience of shunyata, emptiness of self, experience of profound oneness, no self, no private, separate self anywhere in me, no separate self anywhere in the world. Singing the universe away was an experience of entering into the primal void, the void out of which the Big Bang exploded, out of which the universe emerges. Jesus's blood was an experience of extraordinary cosmic love, cosmic compassion, just overwhelming love, just exploding all my boundaries. And I want to mention specifically this birth of the diamond soul because it will come up later. Here I was taken into an experience of reincarnation that changed my entire understanding of the purpose of reincarnation and the direction of reincarnation. In general, the Eastern traditions see reincarnation as culminating in enlightenment and culminating in some type of spiritual awakening in which we recover the awareness of our essential divine nature. Atman is Brahman. We discover our Brahman nature. And when that happens, the Hindus call it moksha, escape. Escape not only from ego, but escape from samsara, escape from physical existence. And the whole idea is we reincarnate, we grow until we awaken spiritually, and then we leave space-time to enjoy our spiritual blessings in some off-planet paradise. Even Buddhism, which focuses on nirvana and the bodhisattvas who commit to coming back again and again to time and space to liberate all sentient beings, are trying to liberate them into parinirvana, final nirvana, which takes place in an off-planet paradise. In this experience, I had a different lesson about what's happening with reincarnation. I had an experience in which I began to reincarnate all my former lives. Some of them I had previously known, but they began to come into me very quickly. And it was like wrapping filaments of white light around a kite spool. And when these filaments, these former lives merged and they reached a critical mass, they merged into one. And there was an explosion in my chest, that diamond light just exploded from my chest and catapulted me into a higher state of consciousness than I had ever been in before, in which I was both an individual, but I was an individual beyond any reference point that I had ever known. And it then gave me a series of instructions in which I began to understand that the dynamic of reincarnation is that we grow bit by bit. We grow. But in the end, all of our former lives merge into a singularity, and a consciousness emerges, which is the conscious integration of all of our life's experiences over thousands and thousands of lifetimes. And this is what I call the birth of the diamond soul. And this takes place not only for individuals, but it's actually the evolutionary project of the entire human species. The entire planet is in the process of giving birth to the diamond soul in history. From there, I'm going to skip a chapter into the last 5 years of work. I'm going to make this very short. The diamond luminosity work in the chapter on the diamond luminosity. When I finished the causal oneness, the benediction of blessing work, I was 15 years into my work. I was existentially completely satisfied. I had been asked to give something in the ocean of blessing, ocean of suffering, and I had been repaid with more blessings than I could possibly count through the benediction of blessings work. And yet there was still 5 years of work remaining to do. After going through yet one more cycle of death and rebirth at a very deep level, I entered into state of consciousness, exceptionally pure diamond light consciousness. Now, when I say diamond light, I'm not simply using a metaphor to describe the light. Many people at many spiritual experiences and many stages of psychedelic work have experiences of light. I had had many experiences of light up to this point in time. The diamond light is an exceptionally clear, advanced, sublime state of consciousness, just completely, absolutely breathtaking. I think it is what Buddhism calls Dharmakaya, the clear light of absolute reality, out of which all existence emerges. Over the next 4 years and 26 sessions, I entered the diamond luminosity only 4 times. These are the 4 sessions in which I entered the diamond luminosity. In between these 4 sessions, more purification, more detoxification, more lessons, more teaching. But these particular states were for me, the deepest and most profound experiences that I encountered on my journey. Once you touch the diamond luminosity, or once I touched the diamond luminosity, then everything else I had been exploring up to that time, the collective psyche, archetypal reality, even the benediction and blessings material, all of it completely lost its allure. The only thing that mattered to me was moving back into the state of diamond consciousness. Now, let me double back and pick up the 9th chapter, which I think is actually the most important chapter of the book. Starting all the way back into the initiation of the universe material, back in session 21, and moving all the way forward, I kept being shown a series of visions about humanity's evolutionary trajectory. And I kept having visions that humanity was coming to a decisive turning point, a before and after point, a pivot point. And we were moving from a long history of struggle into a profound new platform on Earth. And the sessions, so what I did in this chapter is I gathered together all the visions that I had been given, distributed over many sessions. I gathered together into one place so I could address this one theme by itself. And here are the sessions that I address here. First, all the sessions between session 23 and 47 in what I call the visions of awakening, and basically identified 6 visions that occurred over this time in a coherent, consistent story that was unfolding. And the names of these visions that I gave these visions are divine love, all humanity, the guiding intelligence, our species as a single being, collective purification, and the future human. Repeatedly, in very deep time, deep space experiences, I was taken into a time dilation, taken out of linear time, and shown that humanity was moving with great determination to give birth to a new form of humanity, and that we were involved in a tremendous collective purification process, and that this was a before and after turning point for humanity. This is a time of the Great Awakening, the time of the birth of the future human. But in all these years, nowhere was I shown how this was going to happen, how nature was going to pull this off. I saw the vision of where we were going, but no vision of how we were going to get there. And then in the middle of the diamond luminosity work, remember, which had begun in session 45. In the middle of the diamond luminosity work, when I was expecting in the rhythm of the work to be taken back into the diamond luminosity, instead, I was taken far into the future and experienced the death and rebirth of our entire species in the chapter that I call The Great Awakening. I experienced a profound unraveling of life as we had known it. I experienced, as the species, that wasn't Chris Bache at this point, but I had dissolved completely into the species mind, and I experienced a profound unraveling of life as we had known it, a time of tremendous confusion, great suffering, great death. It's hard to describe the magnitude of the impact of experiencing this undoing of life as we have known it. But then, just when things were at their worst, just when it looked like we were all going to die, that this was an extinction event, we passed through the worst of it, and there were people still alive. And as we began to pick ourselves up and to move forward, we found that we had been profoundly changed by the ordeal that we had gone through as a species. There was now alive within us a capacity, a set of capacities that were beyond the capacities that we had taken into this crisis. We had tapped into some deep, deep reservoir within the human heart, within human consciousness. There was a shift that took place at the core of the collective psyche. And this is, I can't emphasize this enough. This is like the plate tectonics shift taking place in the center of the collective unconscious, that every human being who is born after this pivot takes place will be operating within a different collective landscape of the collective psyche. This is the work of the hour. This is what we're trying to give birth to. We are unloading enormous karma, conditioning of our past, all our egos for thousands and thousands of years, trying to do the best we can, hurting each other in all the ways we have. We're trying to unload all the violence that we've done against each other, to other species, men against women, nation against nation, human beings against the species, clearing out that karma to make ourselves available to a profound new infusion of the divine inside the center of our incarnate lives. The future human that emerged from this crisis, I think of as the diamond soul. We are giving birth to the diamond soul. We have been gestating the diamond soul for hundreds of thousands of years, but gestation is long. Birth is very fast. It's a very hard day, as every mother knows, totally absorbing day. But at the end of the day, we give birth to a new form of life. And I think humanity is entering the labor of giving birth to the diamond soul in history. From here, I'll just wrap these up quickly. The last year of my work was, I call, the final vision in this chapter. I was given a last vision, the very last vision of what I call the great visions. There are only so many great visions in the years of work. I won't go into the details of it. It wouldn't make much sense if I tried to talk about it outside of the context of all the other visions. It was my deepest immersion in deep time. What gave me my deepest experience of the future human. And then after that, my sessions pivoted to wrapping things up. I call these last two sessions the goodbye sessions. I was given in 72 an overview of all of my work, just systematic overview, showing me everything that had been done, putting pieces together, helping me understand how things fit together. Much of the structure that I eventually gave my book came from this session, the fruits of my labors. And then it gave me one last session. I didn't know that we were ending, but this larger consciousness that had always been guiding my sessions wrapped it up and gave me one last set of personal teachings and an experience that I call the diamond vision, which was an experience in which I realized, I came to understand that the future human is not just a transformation, a radical expansion of our heart, and not just a radical expansion of our mind, but it is eventually a transformation of our entire sensate experience, our entire physical experience, that we tend to think of our senses as kind of a biomechanical model, but that's not really true. The more consciousness is infusing our physical body, our senses are elevated, have the capacity to be elevated into higher levels of refinement. So when I moved into this experience of diamond vision, I was seeing 1,000 times more clearly, more accurately, with more discrimination and subtlety than I'd ever seen in ordinary vision. And I began to realize that this is true for hearing, all of our senses, our physical senses. We are moving into an elevated condition as a human being. The future human will not be like our current form of being human, physiologically as well as psychologically and spiritually. The last chapter of the book turned out to be the hardest chapter to write. It took me a year just to write that chapter. In it, I tell the story of what it was like to stop my sessions, coming off the mountain. Long story, too long a story to address here. But I will mention just two things. I found that the process of coming off of this journey, off of the mountain, having gone as deep as I had gone into the divine body of the divine, was as difficult as coming up the mountain. That when you have entered so deeply into the divine expanse, when time space can tend to feel kind of dried up, you can lose your interest in being here. This is nothing unique to psychedelics. People who have had deep near-death experiences report the same thing. Carl Jung, when he had his near-death experience in the hospital, he had the same experience. He said, now we come back to the gray boxes. It took me years to really kind of acclimate to being back in time and space for the duration of my life. Okay, that's the gist of it. I'll just mention that all of my writing, all of my books have basically come out of my psychedelic work, whether they are addressing it or not. I do address my psychedelic work in my book, Dark Night, Early Dawn. I also write it. I don't even mention my psychedelic work in the book, The Living Classroom, but basically that book is about it's describing what was happening among my students while I was doing my secretive psychedelic work, because I never let them know I was doing psychedelics. I never brought it to campus. I always kept that a private part of my life. But what I found was the deeper I went into my spiritual practice, my psychedelic spiritual practice, the more my students were being touched in profound ways. And so I had to figure out what was happening. And so this is a book and an exploration of the subtle levels of consciousness and the dynamics of collective consciousness in groups. So that's the story. And I think this is a good place to end it. Thank you very much.
Wow.
Now we come to the best part, the question and answer part.
Yes, I'm going to suggest that people come up here ask questions so that as they do, they'll be on camera. And Chris can see the question. Okay, Martha, you want to start?
Contain myself. Hi, Chris.
Hi.
Thank you so much. Wow. A lot of confirming resonance in what you said. I have a question. I'm a psychotherapist and I practice eye movement desensitization and processing. And I notice that after people go through a set of trauma processing, they're much more connected to divine consciousness. And so I'm curious, with your experience with LSD, how, because it seems like the brain is a conduit to divine consciousness, how do you differentiate, or have you, can you speak to the differentiation between a floods of dopamine and serotonin and oxytocin in the physical brain with the superconsciousness and the experience of diamond consciousness that you were talking about? And does it even matter? Thanks.
Yeah. Well, I'm not a biochemist, and I never have really, I watch from the sidelines the chemists talk about the chemistry of psychedelics and whatnot, but I really don't really attend. That's not where I work. I really have spent all my time thinking about the psychological ramifications, how they function psychologically, how they engage, how they sensitize us to different dimensions of our personal psyche. But if you just keep going, if you just stay at a certain level, then you just keep engaging different dimensions of your personal psyche or nearby things. But if you adopt a methodology by dose and by concentration to drill deep, then you'll uncover in deeper and deeper layers the physiology that makes that possible. I'll leave that to other people. And so how the physiology of psychedelic experience compares to the physiology of what happens among athletes under extreme athletic exertion, I just kind of I have to leave that one to other people. Is it possible for me to see everybody that's on Zoom? Or is that complicating things too much?
You could put it on gallery view.
Yeah, I'm in gallery view, but I'm seeing a lot of numbers, but not everybody. Well, maybe they just have their cameras off. Okay, all right.
So Mark has a question. Mark, unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, no, this is a really timely lecture. I'm right in the middle of reading a book by one of my favorite luminaries, being Ram Dass. And I had the great fortune in my late teens to attend a number of, I won't call them lectures, they were more like happenings at universities in the Northwest in Seattle.
Yeah.
And one of his favorite stories to recount was as he was transitioning from being a psychedelic researcher along with Tim Leary and many other faculty at Berkeley and Harvard. He, when he started his mystical experiences in India, he had given his guru, Neem Karoli Baba, a rather large dose. I forget how many milligrams, but
600 mics the first time and 1,200 micrograms the second time.
Right. So double what you were taking, and yet Neem Karoli Baba continued in his state of consciousness that he normally was in, that there was no alteration. I'm just curious what your hypothesis might be as to how that individual experienced LSD so differently than other Western contemporary experimenters at the time.
It's a fascinating account, isn't it? We have such a deeply ingrained habit of thinking of a person's mind as kind of personal body shaped size. And yet our mystical tradition makes it very clear that advanced meditators or deeply spiritual realized being, their mind is radically different. Neem Karoli's mind was radically open. I mean, he was capable of so many, miracles. I mean, so many extraordinary events just fell off of him. His mind was already so expansive that he could handle the amplification of his sort of body mind, you might say, with barely a ripple. It really wasn't much of a ripple at all. So that to me is a tribute, and I pay deep respect to all such beings. In fact, all my years I was doing this, not only was I a meditator and a practitioner, but I was also an academic, and I was teaching courses on like Ram Dass, and I'd use Neem Karoli Baba in my comparative mysticism course, and I was studying the great mystical traditions and the great saints in those traditions, and they have always been my pole star. They've always been the beings that I've tried to hold myself accountable to, and it's in studying their lives that leads me to emphasize in my book, working with psychedelics, even though the experiences may look like some of their mystical experiences, it's different because this is a path of temporary immersion. It's not a path of abiding presence, temporary immersion. It's an in and out, in and out. And it does affect your spiritual trajectory, but it's a different kind of path than what I think of as the slow bake path of meditation, where you're basically opening up in a way that eventually stabilizes. But I also want to emphasize that the path of spiritual awakening is different than the path of cosmological exploration. You don't have to go to the beginning of time. You don't have to experience the archetypal reality in order to spiritually awaken to your essential Buddha nature or your Brahman nature. This is a different project. Neem Karoli, but if you go deep enough in spiritual practice, there are all sorts of beings who live with wonderful openness to the spiritual dimension. In Buddhism, they call them the Mahasiddhas, the great beings, who are, and Neem Karoli Baba was such a great being.
We have a question in the room.
I'm trying to think of some questions to ask you that would help you reveal more of this awakening, and confess that you have blown me so far away. I'm just really take this in. So I'm left. It's just thank you profoundly for that. Also,
You speak a little louder.
recognizing that I am teaching on your experience. You, we're doing it.
I'm having a little bit of trouble understanding what's being said at the microphone.
Yeah, you
So,
Speak louder.
Can you hear me?
yeah.
My name is Price Wood, and one of the major themes I saw today was the future human. It seems like the theme being that humans are improving and advancing. And this has been a general theme throughout a number of our meetings. And certainly from the Dark Ages, we've come to the Industrial Revolution, and we're a lot more advanced physically and in a number of modern ways. But then from the Dark Ages, we see multiple wars like World War I, World War II, today Putin, what's going on in Haiti, Afghanistan, Mexico, all these people trying to escape third world countries, become industrial countries. And I think, I certainly would like to think we're improving and advancing, But when I look at history and modern day history, I wonder, is it really true?
Yeah. Certainly, if we just do a good look around the world, we could create a very powerful argument that a minority may be improving, but the bulk of humanity is still suffering excruciatingly at the hands of exploitive systems of government and people. I mean, it's just, you know, if you good people have given up your Saturday morning to grow spiritually, most of the people in the cities are at the mall, in mall consciousness, or at the basketball games. I mean, it's a, I want to be careful not to overgeneralize, but I think the conviction that we are growing doesn't come from an historical analysis. You can find support for that, poverty rates and various things. But at the deepest level, I think it really, it's a spiritual vision. It is a vision that emerges from dissolving into the intelligence that is manifesting as evolution, as time and space, as evolution, as this species, which is part of a multi-million, billion-year evolutionary process. And of course, that's a vision that's hard to verify. I mean, hard to replicate or verify. How could we possibly even verify it? So you could say it's a vision that comes from faith, but I think it's more than that, because multiple people, by different methods, whether it's meditation, yoga, or different psychedelics, come in contact with the same underlying trajectory. So when I talk about the birth of the future human, this is a almost common theme among indigenous peoples, among the Hopi peoples, among people coming out of the Brazilian rainforest, in the ayahuasca traditions. It's in the peyote traditions. Many people have this feeling, this intuition, that we are entering a period of history that is giving birth to a new kind of human being. I think Edgar Mitchell saw this, felt this. People talk about Homo spiritualis, Homo noeticus. In this context, my intuition that comes from my visions is no different than these. It's just I'm trying to give voice to it as I experienced it. But if we look at just what's going on in the world today, we certainly could draw a different conclusion. My sense is, at least my visionary experience is, that humanity has begun a process of a collective purification. In order to enact that collective purification, we are literally incarnating the sins of our fathers and mothers. We are incarnating our karmic past. In order to clear that past, we have to make them conscious. And that means it could look like, for generations, that we are actually going backwards, that we are actually kind of more burdened by these negative conditions. But I think that what's actually happening is that we're going through a purification process in order to clear the field for what is coming in the future. That's how I understand the great wars and disasters of the 20th century, as part of a collective historical evolutionary process.
I'll stop reading the newspaper.
Chris, I have a quick question. This is Dan.
Mhm.
In the illusion of time and space, did you get any sense of when the Great Awakening might happen?
You know, when I had these experiences, it didn't give me any particulars. It didn't tell me how, and it didn't tell me when. What it told me was that it would happen. It gave me some insights into the collective dynamics of how it would happen. And this requires an understanding of that the collective psyche is a field, and as a field, it's going to be driven into nonlinear conditions by the massive suffering of generations around the world. and that when it's in its nonlinear conditions, we know from physical systems, when they go into nonlinear conditions, they can do things remarkable, almost miraculous things that they could never do under linear conditions. So it showed me ways in which this was going to happen. It kept saying over and over again, faster than we could ever imagine, faster than we could believe. The pace of the past is irrelevant to the pace of the future. We're going to be put under enormous pressure, and out of that pressure, catalytic changes will move very dramatically. What will that pressure be? For that, in my sense of when, I have to turn to the same resources you do. I have to turn to the scientist. I have to turn to the ecologist. I have to turn to the people who are crunching all of the environmental data to get a sense of how soon this crisis is peaking. And one of the people I admire greatly is that my dear friend, Dwayne Elgin, who has been a futurist and writer on the subjects for years. And his most recent book, Choosing Earth, is a powerful synthesis of where the data seems to say that humanity is going. And I think we're past the point where we can avoid this crisis, the global systems crisis. We've waited too long. Our responses have been too weak. He describes the next 5 decades, the content, the descending content, the spiraling, the breakdown. I think it's really clear that this is going to be happening. At least the trauma of our crisis, the dying part, is going to be happening this century. Decade by decade, it's going to be getting worse. If you just realistically look at the extrapolation of rising sea levels, global climate change, and weather pattern changes, the agricultural crisis that is coming, when the rain is no longer falling where we had prepared for it to fall for generations. There's so many variables. If people who have tracked these, it seems clear that this is going to happen in my children's generation, in my grandchildren's generation, their children. I don't know how. I think of this pivot taking a minimum of 3 generations to move through. It could be longer than that. But here's the thing. I think we either grow up or we lose the planet. We have too many nuclear weapons, too many biological weapons, too much conflict. We either grow up into our soul consciousness, or we probably will go extinct. And extinction is a powerful evolutionary driver. What would it take to make this transition? I mean, serious environmentalists tell us that the carrying capacity of our planet is about 2 billion people. We're crossing 8 billion people. Sooner or later, we are so overextended on our planetary resources. Looks like we're entering a period of a die-off of 1/4, 1/3, 1/2 of the world's population. And picture the terrible, terrible pain and suffering of those who are going through that and those who are witnessing it. I think this is happening sooner rather than later. But it never gave me any specifics.
Thanks. We have another question from the room.
Hi, Chris. This is Susanna Calvert. Thank you for your beautiful work. Just a quick comment about the awakening. I feel like it's already begun. But my question has to do with what you're doing now. I'm just curious what your spiritual practice regarding the use of psychedelics might be currently, now that the main body of your research is behind you.
I'm not doing this work, psychedelic work, anymore. My practice has shifted back towards the other foot of my contemplative practice. My life is about absorbing and deepening the internalization of the many, many experiences that I've already been given, and sharing them to help, just to let them be useful to other people. Because I think that my book, LSD and the Mind of the Universe, is relevant to people who never ever touch a psychedelic, because there's a cosmology, there's a vision of how the world works, there's an understanding of how the dynamics of the world works, which I think is relevant to anyone who has a spiritual practice, which is not necessarily psychedelic at all. So my practice now is really about sharing, writing, teaching, and contemplative practice.
Thank you. We have a Zoom, Claire, if you could unmute yourself.
Hey, Chris, thank you so much. Wow. I want to talk about your psychedelic, the idea of looking at this as cosmological research, and the concept of objectivity in across, the world, of different people having the same experiences, understanding the universe, and being given downloads of what really is. And wow, you have just, I've not read your book yet, but I certainly will. You've just answered so many questions, and your research, your journeys have taken, it wasn't until this, this last 6 months of my life, I would have been even able to listen to what you said and understood it. It's so beautiful. Of course, it's divine timing. and the idea that objectivity is real, and that time is a construct, and quantum physics is being proven, every day through our psychedelic journeys. And we're understanding how and it's all coming together so fast now in our evolution. We talk about how, how bad things are in the world today with war and such, but we're doing the evolutionary work, and it's what you have done, I believe, actually lifts our entire humanity because of the depth that you went to. That's what I see. How would you phrase that in your 73 sessions and all the work that you've done?
Well, I think all of our work, everything we do, everything that every individual does, lifts or weighs down all of humanity, because we are hardwired into humanity. Our individual mind is a cell within the collective mind. So everything we learn, everything we accomplish, every good we bring into the world is a good that the entire species keeps forever. So my understanding is, when I die, I take my experiences with me, and they fold over into my soul, and my soul continues to grow individually. But all of my experiences, because I had these experiences as a human being, all of my experiences and all of our experiences become part of the bank of the collective unconscious, the bank of humanity. And so that all of our experiences are alive within the collective psyche to be used as the collective psyche sees fit, or as other incarnating souls see fit. I do think that psychedelics, in this respect, my conviction is that psychedelics represent a turning point in the way of doing philosophy, not just a turning point in healing, but how we do philosophy. That is, we can now enter into these temporary hypersensitive states, come back into our ordinary consciousness and integrate them and write them up, go back into deep states and come back in and write them up. And then we can take our narrative and compare it to other people who are going through the same process. Now, if their process is not with discipline, well, then it may not be that much useful. But if we have people who are pressing these boundaries with discipline and with rigor, then I would take, no one person's experience is worth too much, because a person can always make mistakes and be self-deluded. But if their experience compares favorably or with a large overlap with someone else's experiences and other people's experiences, that's where we want to be eventually. We want to put the journeys of many seasoned journeyers on the table and look at them simultaneously to sort of see where the overlap is and where the lack of overlap is. That's the birth of a new discipline of doing philosophy. This is what I think of as psychedelic philosophy,
Mhm.
the
Well,
doing of a psychedelic tradition.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Richard Rudd mentions in his book Gene Keys the term
Mhm.
anthroposophy, which I
Mhm.
think fits really well right here in understanding what we're creating. New science.
Yeah.
We're creating
Yeah.
an anthro science that's a synergy of all of sciences.
Yeah. Rich is a wonderful guy. He and I did a series on reincarnation together. I really like working with Richard.
Oh wow, I'd love to see it too.
Mhm.
Wonderful. Thank you again today.
You're welcome.
We have another one from the room here. So,
Hi, Chris. My name is Sarah Hopkins, and my question, I get the idea that you were able to experience all of this through a continual refinement of your senses. And I was wondering if you ever experienced uh, other individuals in your journeys, such as guides or teachers.
Yeah.
That's it. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of interest on the metaphysical status of the entities that we experience in our journeys. And there's a lot of discussion in the DMT community, particularly since DMT is a psychedelic that tends to put people in contact with a lot of individual beings, the machine elves, as they're sometimes called. Uh, you know, people have experiences of spirit guides, and they have experiences of discarnate beings in psychedelic space. It's pretty common, and I have no problems with that. I mean, once you understand that physical reality is a small percentage of total reality. I mean, even the scientists are telling us that 95, 96% of the known universe is invisible, right? Dark energy and dark matter. But even the spiritual universe, the vast majority of life is non-physical. So naturally, we would bump into it sometimes in our sessions. But in my sessions, I haven't had too many of those experiences, and I've pondered that. In my sessions, I've had many experiences of the deep fabric of existence. And I always experienced myself in communion with and in dialogue with an intelligence, but not an intelligence that ever concretized itself in specific form. But as my capacity deepened, I was taken deeper into the ocean of being, and that consciousness was always there in an ever deepening form. So that the way, I think you kind of have to be a self to experience a self in psychedelic or spiritual place. That is, if you kind of maintain your boundaries of a sort, when you go into psychedelic space, what you experience is always going to be a reflection of the seed that you brought into the experience. It's not like we go into psychedelic space or spiritual space and we pluck these experiences like plucking an apple off of a tree. It's much more subtle, interactive process. My sense is when we take a psychedelic, we enter an infinite ocean of possibilities, and we drop our mind into that ocean like a seed, and it catalyzes a set of experiences out of its infinite potential. Those experiences change us, and if we take them in and let them change us and purify us, then the seed that we drop into that ocean in our next session is different. It has fewer restrictions, fewer limitations, and it catalyzes a deeper set of experiences out of that infinite ocean. So if you keep this up over and over and over again, you're catalyzing an ever deepening communion with an infinite intelligence, an infinite expanse of being. And I think it's something about the characteristics of my particular journey that it tended to grind me up really, really fine. And it gave me experiences of the great breadth of being rather than giving me experiences of contact with individual persons of that being. You know what I mean? Yeah. And I think it's a both and. I think both are true. Yeah.
Powerful. Carol?
I can't thank you enough again.
Speak right into the mic.
I know everyone. What I wanted to ask is if you would share something about how, with all of these amazing expansions of consciousness, that you also stay grounded and centered, as in reading his books, I know he did. But would you speak a little bit to that? And I'm glad you mentioned the living classroom, because that's another aspect when you read these books that, yes, these experiences happened, but they rippled throughout every aspect of his life. So thank you for sharing that too.
Yeah. I'm just getting a notice that my battery is running low. So if I disappear, it's only because of technological limitations. Yeah, it's really important to stay grounded. I had a policy when I was doing this work, and I would never talk about any session until I had lived with it for at least 5 years. Because these things they're huge. They unleash enormous waves of energy and insight into your life. And if you're going to use them productively, you have to commit yourself to a lifestyle, a spiritual practice that helps you integrate them, hold on to them, understand them. And I'm sure, for me, I'm an academic, so one of the ways I understand them, I try to integrate them, is through understanding them. And I've spent years studying my sessions to try to fathom the interconnectedness of the principles that were operating in them. If I were an artist like Alex Gray, I might be painting my walls, with these visions, or poets who would be giving poetic expression, because that's how their being integrates these experiences. For me, I integrate them in terms of staying grounded in my work in the world. My family, I'm a father, and staying grounded in my family, and my students, staying grounded in my career, no matter where I was on Saturday. On Monday, I was back in the classroom giving my classes. So that I found that kind of commitment to an embodied life really helped keep my ground firmly planted on the earth. I also want to say that you do not, I can't emphasize this enough, you have to be very careful entering these territories. Not because psychedelics are inherently dangerous, it's just that you're amplifying the mind, and there are some people who they should not go into this territory. There are some people who Jung would not work with because he did not think they were ready in the psychological space to go into analytic on that particular analytic journey. The same thing is true with psychedelics. There's a percentage of people who shouldn't go near these at all, just because their psyche is balanced such, or susceptible, or vulnerable in a way that it could do lasting damage. And I would not want anything that I did to result in somebody hurting themselves by going into these states unprepared, under less than ideal conditions. You want to be careful. You want to be working with people who know what they're doing. You want to have your safety net, because you're opening yourself up to the vast expanse of the universe, and just the expansion can be very demanding, and it can fragment. I have a constitution that seems to allow me to open up to great expanse and to contract without great problem. I mean, if you look at my astrological chart, it seems to be in there. Not everybody is built like that. Also, I seem to have a constitution that thrived on deep exploration. But that's like, there are crazy people who climb up to the top of Mount Everest. I don't know why they would ever do that, but it takes a certain character, a certain constitution to undergo that, or to go to the North Pole. It takes a certain fabric in the being. And there, you don't want to go into this territory without being careful. So caution, concern, staying grounded, always staying grounded. And I have spent 20 years plus grounding after my journey ended. And it continues the process continues.
Thank you. So I hope your battery will last for two more questions.
Okay, good luck. Let's try.
Angela, why don't you unmute?
Yes, hi.
Hi, Angela.
I appreciate you very much. I have only a billion questions, but I'll keep it simple. Your battery. You've undergone many, many soul trips, and since we are always talking about the collective mind, I can't help but wonder why these trips are always lonely. Are you meeting other souls on another trip? Does this ever happen other than higher beings? I wonder, you're not the only person, human being, who's tripping, so to speak, and you are not tripping, you're traveling. Do you ever, or have you ever come across others that are living on this earth now, or have been, or that are going on similar travels and collaborated in some ways?
Yeah, that just hasn't been part of my journey. It hasn't been part of, and I want to say, I didn't script my journey. And when you're working with doses this high, you can bring all the good intentions to them or all the specific intentions. It's irrelevant. The force is, it's so powerful. A larger consciousness far beyond my reach was orchestrating. The sessions were clearly orchestrated by an intelligence. There was an intelligence manifesting itself, but it wasn't my intelligence. It was something larger. And I never felt lonely. I mean, it's just the opposite. To feel the intelligence of the universe, the embrace of the universe, to be loved like you can be loved in these sessions, to be embraced intellectually, to be shown the vistas that you are sometimes shown. It's just such a deeply satisfying, soul nurturing experience. I never felt lonely. Now, there are some people, I want to mention in my book, Dark Night, Early Dawn, I was asking the question, if you use different methods to explore the universe, are we coming up with overlapping, and is there a consensus in our visions, or are we differentiating, separating in our visions? And so I look at psychedelic research, near-death episode research, and Robert Monroe's out-of-body research. Robert Monroe wrote 3 books on out-of-body experience, fascinating man. He has lots of experience of meeting beings, meeting souls, meeting beings who are in between, and even during their current lifetimes, he's meeting them. And so one of the things I examine is, why are his experiences so different from my experiences? Can we have an understanding of why that happens? And so I propose an explanation of why that happens. And I think part of it has to do with discrete beings only exist at one level of spiritual reality. When you go beyond that level of reality, there are not discrete beings there. There are vast beings. Like when you enter archetypal reality, you don't so much find souls there. You're dealing with vast tracts of intelligence and power and capacity. Okay? So I think it's partly a matter of depth and partly a matter of how thoroughly ground up you're willing to let yourself, or your practice makes you be, in terms of what you meet there. And then the intelligence sets the course. And so I'm the student, and I let it take me wherever it wants to take me.
Part of why I was wondering this was because we're speaking of a collective mind, collective soul. We are all connected in some ways. So I can't help but wonder, why aren't we educated collectively as well? Why are we each undertaking these awakenings separately from one another? Why aren't we doing this together?
You know, we are, but it happens in monasteries. It happens sometimes in festivals. Um, I think where people gather and meditate together, whether they gather and learn together, whether they gather and do spiritual practice together, all of these things are contributing. All of us are doing it together. This meeting is an example of us coming together because I think there's an energy when we merge our intention and work together. This has an energy that flows outward beyond the boundaries of the group. So we're nourishing this field of all seekers when we do what we're doing today.
All right, Trish, I want you to unmute.
Okay, first of all, I wanted to say just thank you so much. This is absolutely fascinating. I can't wait to read your book. But my question is, you've talked about the temporary experience, temporary immersion, and I'm wondering to what extent have you been able to sustain any of the higher levels of consciousness that you experienced as you integrated it back into your more 3D physical experience?
Yeah. Not much in that sense. And here's the difference between our model for thinking about this is usually a spiritual awakening model. So, and this is where I want to once again emphasize the difference between spiritual awakening and cosmological exploration. I think under the way my sessions brought me around is that they took me deep into the universe, and at the very end, it brought me back into something like classic spiritual awakening. And I think it did that in order to give me a focus, a way of focusing, a way of relating the deep cosmic journey into the classic project of becoming transparently and becoming awake on this earth. And it showed me that what I had experienced in deep cosmological levels as the diamond luminosity, the closest thing to that in our physical existence is what Buddhism calls the nature of mind, our awakened nature, or Hinduism calls Brahman, our Brahman nature. So that it showed me what embodied luminosity looks like, and as a point of reference for me to do my practice. And I do my practice at that level. And I seek to sensitize myself and to relax into what Buddhists call the nature of mind, the nature of one's essential nature. But even if I got very good at this, and even as I became, what you would call enlightened in my lifetime, which I'm not, but if I did do that, even that would not be the stabilization of diamond luminosity. Now, there are some beings who can stabilize these very, very exalted states. These are great, great beings who have spent generations and generations and generations on the mountain unfolding themselves. This is, beings who incarnate again and again and again after they've been enlightened. We know these beings. We can meet these beings. That's just not me. It would take me many generations to be able to stabilize some of the things I've experienced in an abiding way. There have been great gifts, abiding gifts. One of the gifts is I have no fear of death. I mean, to me, if there were one thing that I wish I could give people from my experiences, it would be to lose your fear of death. Because if you're afraid of dying, you've got everything all upside down. Birth is when the hard work is. Death is easy. Death is graduation. Death is going back to source. I have no fear of death whatsoever. And there are other derivatives that come, but I can't say that I've stabilized deep time. I mean, I don't even know what that would look like. I've asked myself, what would it even mean for a time being to stabilize deep time, experiences in which you're experiencing tens of thousands of years simultaneously as a window of time? How does a finite being stabilize the experience of infinity? And the conclusion I've come to is you can't internalize infinity. All you can do is turn your finite life to make it completely transparent and in service of this infinity. You don't bring it into you, you bring you into it. Okay? And that's my spiritual practice these days.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's beautiful. Tom?
Chris, am I on here?
No, you are now.
Okay, thank you. Chris, I'm like Robert Bushman a few minutes ago. I'm just completely blown away. This is one of the most magnificent presentations we've ever had. I'd love to have a week to just talk to you, but it just has been wonderful. I look forward to reading your books. I've not read them, and I can't wait to do so.
Thank you.
I take it, one final question. I take it that the longevity of the project was self-determining. In other words, you didn't plan it to be 20 years, you didn't plan it to be 73 doses.
Yeah.
The guidance of this intelligent infinity with which you were interacting was driving the bus, so to speak, in terms of how it evolved. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. I didn't anticipate it stretching out over 20 years, and I didn't anticipate it ending when it did.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very, very, very much. It's been a magnificent presentation. I don't know, did we just lose it? Because,
We might have, yeah.
yeah. Well,
That's good timing.
well, folks, again, this is the miracle of this group that we are so blessed with presentations like this. And Chris, I don't know if you can hear me, but again, thank you so much. It's been wonderful. And next month, we're going to have Glenn Weiner, a local clinical psychologist, who's going to present. And then the following month, we're going to have Robert Bushman. And we got some wonderful programs lined up for the year. So thank you for being here. We've got, again, the potluck lunch out in the hallway. And see you next time. See you next time. One thing I also want to mention that I forgot to is that we now, thanks to Susanna Calvert, we have a YouTube channel, and so the programs will be, the video recordings of the programs will be available not only on Facebook as they have heretofore, but also on YouTube. Susanna, what's the link to that? Do we just go to the website and find it, or how do we find it? All right, so Google Richmond Ions on YouTube, and it should come up, and we're moving onward and upward. So thank you very much.